I always thought my parents were normal. Strict, sure, but not unusual. They had rules I thought every kid had to follow. I wasn't allowed to leave my room after dark. I couldn't look into the basement, no matter what I heard coming from it. Dinner was at exactly 7 p.m., and I had to eat everything on my plate, even if I wasn't hungry. I thought all families were like this. It wasn't until I spent the night at my best friend's house that I realized something was wrong. At his house, there were no locks on the fridge. The basement door was wide open. His parents let him stay up past 9 p.m. without checking in on him every 30 minutes. It was like stepping into another world, one where parents weren't always watching, always listening. When I got home the next morning, my mother stood in the doorway, waiting. Her smile was too wide, too forced. "Did you have fun?" she asked, but her voice was tight, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. I nodded, forcing myself to act normal. That night, I woke up to a sound, whispers drifting through the vents. At first, I thought my parents were just talking, but then I realized there was something else mixed in. A low, guttural growl. My stomach twisted, my breath catching in my throat. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to see. I tiptoed out of bed, pressing my ear against my door. The whispers grew louder. Slowly, I turned the handle and peered into the hallway. The light from the kitchen flickered, off, then on, then off again. My parents' voices melted into something else, something inhuman. I crept down the hall, my bare feet silent against the wood. The basement door was open, just a crack, enough for a sliver of light to spill out. I knew I wasn't allowed to look, but my body moved on its own. My fingers brushed against the wood as I pulled the door open just a little more. Something moved in the darkness. It wasn't my parents. Not anymore. Their backs were arched unnaturally, their limbs too long, their skin shifting as if something slithered beneath it. Their heads snapped toward me at the same time, their eyes completely black. My mother's mouth stretched into a grin, wider than it should have been. "Did you see something you shouldn't have, sweetheart?" she cooed, her voice layered with something else, something that wasn't hers. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. My father took a step forward, his body twitching as if he wasn't used to it. "You know the rules," he whispered, his voice echoing, like 100 voices speaking at once. "Go back to bed." I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. My heart pounded against my ribs as I ran to my room, locking the door behind me. I pulled the blankets over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. Maybe if I stayed quiet, they'd forget I saw anything. The next morning, everything was normal. My parents sat at the breakfast table, smiling like nothing had happened. But their eyes lingered on me too long, their movements just a little too stiff. That night, the whispers returned. Closer this time. Right outside my door. And then, the handle started to turn. I didn't wait to see what would happen. I grabbed my phone, fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could barely whisper out my address before the door creaked open. I dropped the phone and dove under my bed, my heart hammering in my chest. Heavy footsteps entered my room. I clamped a hand over my mouth, willing myself not to breathe too loudly. The thing that looked like my mother crouched down, peering under the bed. Her head tilted unnaturally, her black eyes locked onto mine. "Sweetheart," she whispered, reaching out. "Come out. Let's talk." Then, a loud knock echoed through the house. The police. My mother's head snapped up. In an instant, she and my father were gone, retreating into the darkness of the hallway. I stayed frozen as I heard the front door crash open, officers storming inside. I crawled out from under the bed, gasping for air as a flashlight beam landed on me. "Are you okay, kid?" one of the officers asked. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. The house was searched, but my parents were nowhere to be found. No basement, no strange lights, just an empty house filled with shadows. The officers took me to the station, and social services got involved. They placed me in temporary care, but I never felt safe. Because at night, I still heard the whispers. And sometimes, just outside my window, I saw them. Watching. Waiting. I know they'll come back for me. And this time, I don't think I'll be able to escape. The police never found my parents. They searched the house, combed through every room, every closet, even beneath the floorboards. Nothing. It was as if they had never existed. Social services placed me with a temporary foster family, a nice couple who tried their best to make me feel safe. They installed security cameras around the house, put extra locks on my door, and even stationed a police officer outside for the first few nights. But I knew it wasn't enough. Because I still heard the whispers. At first, they were distant, barely more than a murmur carried by the wind. Then, they grew louder. Closer. They slithered through the vents at night, curling around my ears like ghostly fingers. Sweetheart, they cooed. Come home. I kept my curtains shut, but sometimes, when the wind blew just right, I could see them standing at the edge of the foster parents' yard. Not my parents. Not anymore. Just two silhouettes with glowing black eyes, watching. Waiting. One night, I woke up to the sound of static. I turned over, groggy, reaching for my phone, but it wasn't my phone that was making the noise. It was the baby monitor. The foster family had a newborn, and they kept a baby monitor in her room. But the sound coming through wasn't crying. It was whispering. And something else. A deep, wet breathing, as if something enormous was crouched over the crib, inhaling the baby's scent. Heart pounding, I scrambled out of bed and ran down the hall. The nursery door was ajar, creaking softly in the dim light. Inside, the baby lay in her crib, silent. Too silent. I rushed to her side and shook her gently. She let out a tiny breath, then opened her eyes. For a split second, they weren't blue, they were black. I stumbled back, my own breath coming in ragged gasps. The baby let out a soft giggle, but something about it was wrong. It was layered, distorted, as if more than one voice was laughing inside her tiny chest. I grabbed the monitor and turned it off. But even then, the whispers didn't stop. The next day, the police installed security slabs, thick, reinforced panels over the windows and doors, meant to keep intruders out. The foster parents didn't question it. The officers told them it was for my safety. But I knew better. It wasn't to keep anything out. It was to keep something in. That night, I dreamed of the basement again. The flickering lights. The wrongness in my parents' bodies. My mother's too wide grin. Did you see something you shouldn't have, sweetheart? I woke up to the sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but then I realized, it was coming from inside the walls. Slow, deliberate. Like nails dragging against wood. I pressed my ear against the wall, my pulse thundering in my veins. Sweetheart, a voice whispered from the other side. I jerked away, stumbling toward the door. But the moment my fingers touched the handle, the lights flickered. The air turned thick, heavy, like the entire house was holding its breath. And then, the power went out. The baby monitor crackled back to life. A burst of static, then silence. And then, we found you. The front door slammed open. The security slabs groaned as something heavy pressed against them, the metal shrieking in protest. I ran, heart in my throat, as the shadows in the hallway stretched and twisted, forming shapes that weren't quite human. The foster father shouted from downstairs. A gunshot rang out, followed by a sickening squelch and a gurgling scream. I didn't stop running. I reached the baby's room just as the crib began to shake. The baby was crying now, but the sound was drowned out by the awful, wet breathing filling the room. A figure loomed in the corner, tall, its body shifting, writhing like a mass of living shadows. Its eyes burned black, and when it opened its mouth, I saw teeth. Rows and rows of them. "Come home," it rasped. I grabbed the baby and ran. Outside, the officer stationed at the house was yelling into his radio. The streetlights flickered, casting jagged shadows across the pavement. The moment he saw me, he raised his gun. "Get down," he shouted. I obeyed, dropping to the ground, shielding the baby with my body. A deafening roar split the air, followed by a blinding flash. The creature screamed, its voice 1,000-layered shrieks. I turned just in time to see it retreating, its form melting into the shadows as more police cars skidded onto the street. The officer helped me up, his hands shaking. "It's gone," he muttered, half to himself. "For now." They moved me again after that. New town, new foster home. More security. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. Because at night, the whispers always return. And I know they're getting closer. Then, one night, the security alarms blared. Red lights flashed through the house, painting the walls in eerie, shifting patterns. I bolted upright, heart hammering. Heavy footsteps echoed through the hall, too many to count. The foster parents screamed. I heard the door shatter. I grabbed the baby and ran, but this time, they were faster. Shadows surged through the house, tendrils reaching for me. The air turned ice cold, suffocating. A hand, too long, too thin, clamped around my ankle. I kicked and screamed, but its grip was like iron. It dragged me backward, toward the darkness, toward the whispering voices that chanted my name. "Come home." The baby wailed in my arms, her cries merging with my own. Then, gunfire. Shouts. The creature recoiled, shrieking as floodlights cut through the night. Officers stormed the house, their weapons blazing. The thing released me, its form writhing, contorting in agony. I scrambled to my feet, gasping, as the shadows retreated once more. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. Because they always find me. And next time, I might not escape. They always find me. And this time, I knew escape wasn't an option. The new foster home was buried deep in the countryside, miles away from the nearest town. The police assured me it was safe, that the reinforced doors, security lights, and 24-hour surveillance would keep them out. But I knew better. I didn't sleep. I didn't even turn off the lights. I sat in bed, clutching the baby monitor in one hand and a knife in the other. The baby slept soundly in the crib beside me, her tiny chest rising and falling with each steady breath. For now, she was safe. For now, we were both safe. Then, at exactly 3:13 a.m., the baby monitor crackled to life. I bolted upright. The sound of static buzzed in my ears, but underneath it, something else, something wet, slithering, breathing. "Sweetheart," the voice whispered. "Come home." My blood turned to ice. The air grew thick, suffocating. My breath came in shallow gasps. I reached for my phone, but before I could dial, the night vision camera in the room's corner flickered. And then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway. It was tall, too tall, its limbs stretched like something that had forgotten how to be human. Its mouth hung open in a jagged, unnatural grin, revealing rows upon rows of needle-like teeth. Its eyes were pits of nothingness, black voids that swallowed the light. The baby stirred in her crib, whimpering. I gripped the knife tighter. "Stay away." It didn't move. It didn't blink. It only watched. And then, the lights went out. The room was swallowed in absolute darkness, but I still felt it. I felt it moving closer, felt the temperature plummet as its rancid breath brushed against my face. The baby shrieked. I lunged, scooping her into my arms and bolting for the door. But the hallway was wrong. The house was wrong. The walls stretched endlessly in both directions, pulsing like something alive. The air was thick with whispers, growing louder, a cacophony of voices all chanting the same thing. Come home. A cold hand clamped onto my wrist. I screamed, wrenching myself free, stumbling down the impossible hallway. Doors loomed on either side, stretching taller, warping, shifting like they were never really doors at all. The whispers curled around me, pressing against my skull, seeping into my mind. I reached the end of the hallway, only there was no end. Just darkness. Just an abyss that stretched infinitely in all directions. And then, I was falling. I woke up to silence. The baby was gone. My heart stopped. My hands clawed at the floor, feeling nothing but cold, damp stone. This wasn't the house. This was something else. A basement. The basement. My breath hitched. The memories came rushing back, my parents, their unnatural smiles, their hollow eyes. The way their voices had twisted, becoming something inhuman. I had seen something I shouldn't have. And now, I was back where it all began. A single, flickering bulb swayed above me. And then, the whispering returned. Sweetheart, my mother's voice cooed. Did you really think you could run? I turned slowly. They stood in the corner, barely human anymore. Their limbs bent at impossible angles, their heads lolling unnaturally. My mother's too wide grin stretched impossibly further as she took a step forward. My father's voice joined hers, overlapping, layered, something monstrous hiding beneath. It's time to come home. The shadows in the room slithered, taking shape, twisting into arms, mouths, teeth. The walls pulsed, alive, closing in. The baby's cries echoed from somewhere in the darkness, sharp and panicked. I ran. I ran through corridors that shouldn't exist, past doorways that led nowhere, past mirrors that didn't show my reflection. The house had swallowed me whole. But I wouldn't let it take the baby. I followed the sound of her cries, my lungs burning, my vision swimming. The whispers clawed at my mind, trying to drag me under. But then, I saw her. She lay in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of writhing shadows. Her tiny face was red, her cries piercing. And the thing that had once been my mother was reaching for her. No! I roared, charging forward. The shadows lunged, wrapping around my arms, my legs, my throat. I fought, clawing, kicking, gasping for breath. I reached the baby, grabbing her just as the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. And then, I remembered. The matches in my pocket. With shaking fingers, I struck one. The flame flickered, tiny, fragile. But it was enough. The shadows recoiled, hissing. My mother screamed, her form flickering between human and something else. I grabbed the nearest cloth, setting it ablaze, and threw it against the walls. Fire roared to life. The house shrieked. The walls convulsed, the ceiling cracked. The shadows burned, their screams filling the air. I ran, clutching the baby close as the world around us collapsed. The last thing I saw before everything turned to flames was my parents' faces, melting away, their mouths stretched wide in an eternal, soundless scream. I woke up in a hospital. The baby was safe. The fire had consumed everything. They found me in the wreckage, barely breathing. They asked me what had happened, but I said nothing. No one would believe me anyway. They think it's over. I know better. Because last night, as I lay in my hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, I heard it again. The whispering. Sweetheart, we'll always find you. And this time, I know there's nowhere left to run.